this is something that I've been working on a whole bunch of stuff about Irish miners, and this is some I came across a PhD thesis actually about a year ago by a gentleman by the name of Nathan Delaney out of Case Western about transatlantic copper markets, which gave me some real insight into some of the stuff that I really had a tremendous problems understanding. And there's all kinds of fascinating things that went on over a series of years. But this is kind of a different view that you might get historically from some of this stuff, and especially about some of the people involved. But here goes. So if we go back to the 19th century, prior to 1840, copper production was primarily in Europe, in Cornwall, and in Saxony and in Germany, which at the time was a separate state, with smelting in both locations, but especially in Swansea. The major markets were military, construction, ornamental, and naval. And on the top picture there is the USS Constitution in dry dock, showing the copper sheeting that they would put on to prevent barnacles from attaching to the wooden ships, sailing ships of the time. Around that same period of time, Chile developed as a major producer, exporting initially high grade, but then after about 1850, a matte, which came to be called Chile bar. And I have it spelt there C-H-I-L-I, but it's also, you commonly see it spelled C-H-I-L-E, but it's named for the country Chile, but it's always spelled with lowercase for whatever reason. And they exported this quite a bit to both North America, to Baltimore and Boston area where there were refineries, and to Europe. In the UK, they eliminated all tariffs on copper in about 1840. And by 1854, their imports exceeded domestic production. What happened typically was prices would surge when wars were on, like the Crimean War, the Napoleonic Wars, or during the US Civil War. And then they would go down during peacetime. There were new markets developing in steam boilers, which were becoming popular at the time. Initially, the ore prices would be set, as the series Poldark indicated, in sales at Swansea. But there was always a separate metal price, which came out of the London Stock Exchange. There was a special room at the London Stock Exchange. It was actually a pub called the Lombard, where the guys who were interested in copper metal would meet and set metal prices. After the US Civil War, copper prices in the US at one time reached 52 cents a pound, which was an enormous price. But they immediately collapsed after the war to about 15 cents a pound. And then in 1868, there was a collapse of the price in Europe and in London in general. And Cornish mining became largely uneconomic. And in one period of about 2 months, almost 40% of the miners in Cornwall were laid off, beginning the great Cornish diaspora to Keweenaw and to Australia and various other places. In 1869, the Michigan copper producers, which were the main copper producers in the US at the time, set up an association. And through lobbying, they got the Congress to put very heavy tariffs on imported copper, 5 cents a pound on finished copper, or 45% on finished goods. And then they also instituted a procedure later, after Alexander Agassiz got control of the association, where they would only sell in very large lots, and they would absolutely not sell at all to any traders. So anybody who was dealing with the London Metal Exchange or like entities, they just wouldn't sell to. And then a very major event happened after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, 1871. Much of the world, including Germany and the United States, switched to a gold standard. The US actually didn't go on it until 1873. But the problem with a gold standard is that if gold production doesn't match the increase in production of all other goods, like manufactured goods or agricultural goods or whatever, then there's going to be deflation. And gold production in actuality worldwide was falling between about 1870 and about 1895. And this ushered in a period of extreme deflation worldwide, but especially in the US. And then in 1876, after the telegraph system could connect places like Australia and Chile, which were major exporters of copper to the UK, when they could get, rapid communication, the London Metal Exchange was actually set up and began to trade contract in what they call Chile bar copper. So this here, if I can show you this is a very interesting combination where it shows the relative ratio of production of various areas at different times. So if we look here now at about 1870, the major producer was now South America, which was at that time primarily Chile. Europe was the second biggest producer. Would be the UK and Germany. And then if you come down here, you see North America was, 10% of the world production at that time. So North America really wasn't a factor. So that is why the Michigan producers said, hey, we want to have a closed market that we can operate in, and we can control our own pricing here. And for a while, it worked, because if you look at the blue here, which is the US price relative to the UK price or the German price, it was at the time initially way higher. But then when the recession set in the US by 1873, the US price dropped as well. But nevertheless, for the next, almost 10 years, till about 1880, 1881, the US price remained significantly higher than the UK price, typically about 20% difference. So there was a benefit to the US producers operating this way. The German price is also in here, that's in red, and the German price was higher as well. And that reflected the higher cost in Germany of Saxon production. So when this fight started, there were, as we say, some big dogs in this fight. This man here is Alexander Agassiz. He was the head of Calumet and Hecla, the Boston-based company that was really the major producer up in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan. But Agassiz, especially after his father died, his father was a professor at Harvard. He was a Swiss immigrant. His father had come over here. He was a great geologist and botanist. And his father had a whole museum and combination of things at Harvard, all kinds of collections. And Agassiz actually was way more interested in his father's collection at Harvard than he was in running Calumet and Hecla. But he remained in charge of Calumet and Hecla until he passed away in 1910. The Rothschild family, London and Paris based, ownership in Rio Tinto, a French company called Immetal, and later an interest in Anaconda. And then this gentleman up here is Wilhelm Merton. And we'll talk about him in some more detail later. But eventually they were, Henry Merton and Company was a founding member of the London Metal Exchange. And eventually they founded a company in Germany called Metallgesellschaft, which became a very important company. And the last, and not least by any means, were the Lewisham brothers. They were from an old line Hamburg family. They initially were traders in things like bristles for brushes and things like that, but morphed into the copper trade in the late 1860s and were very important in connecting the US with the German market. But things, of course, kept changing. Markets were really, really changing. The transcontinental cables, the electric motor, the light bulb, demand exploded. And by the time they figured out how to make these wires, copper wire, the only material that would work was relatively pure lake copper. Not all lake copper was refined to about 99% purity, but when it was, that was the only copper that would work at the time, because the lake copper, Lake Superior copper, is a natural copper metal. It's not a sulfide or an oxide. And the only people who really understood this early on were the Lewisham brothers, the former Harsey traders, and they exported to Germany. But of course, Alexander Agassiz didn't want to sell to them because they were traders. So they had a hard time getting hold of much of the material. So in 1878-83, William Andrews Clark in Montana and the Lewisham brothers started mining and smelting in Butte. But Butte was primarily a silver camp at the time, and copper for them was a byproduct of silver and gold recovery. And then in 1882, along came Marcus Daly, and he, along with his partner, which I'll talk about a little bit later, managed to export high-grade copper to Swansea. And that was the first time that copper had actually been shipped from the Butte area profitably. Up to then, it was strictly a byproduct. Electrolytic copper production had started. It was in its infancy in Germany in about 1880, and it was also in the United States and in England. But when the copper production started increasing in North America, and especially in Montana, in 1883, Agassiz and Company said, we're going to put the Montana guys out of business. And they cut the price first from 18 to 12 cents and then to 10 cents a pound to try and bankrupt the Montana producers. The two gentlemen here on the right are Otto and Adolf Lewisham. So in Butte, we have this Irish immigrant, an experienced gold and silver miner named Marcus Daly. And he acquired some what he thought were silver prospects in the Anaconda and the Mountain Con, but they turned out to be great copper prospects. So he convinced a San Francisco person that he was familiar with, a friend of Hearst, George Hearst, called James Bin Hagen. And Hagen financed some of the initial development, and then he sold high-grade copper to Swansea at a profit. And when that money was pumped back into Daly's Montana operation, he was able to build a new smelter in Anaconda, 20 miles away. He hired Saxon engineers to build it. He recruited Welsh smeltermen to run the plant. And then he continued to sell matte, which was 50 to 70% copper, to Swansea in Germany, as well as to Eastern US refineries. And then when the Michigan guys cut their pricing, Daly became obsessed with lowering costs. And he eventually rebuilt his smelters, and he built a new one, and he did multiple rebuilds, and he was targeting matte costs of 3 cents a pound, and he actually achieved by about 1890 about a 5 cent a pound cost for matte. That would have been equivalent to about a 7 cent a pound cost for finished copper. So if you look at what happened in 1883, 84, Agassiz of cutting the price had absolutely no impact whatsoever on US production. None. Didn't stop a thing. So then there was this gentleman in France by the name of Eugene Secretan. He was tied in with the leading lights of the French copper industry. He was tied in with the defense ministry. He was tied in with a company called Société de Métaux. And he also was tied in with the banks and had some familiarity with financiers. And he started a consortium where they said they were basically, with the price going down, why not buy up all the contracts for Chili Bar? And they basically tried to do that with financing from French banks and the Rothschilds. But of course, the world market for copper was changing. And now we go to 1887 and we look at what's happening. Chili Bar is now only 20% of world production. Oops, I'm sorry. Europe is about 30% of world production, and the US is about 25%, 26%. So as he began to buy up these contracts, the price first jumped to 80 British pounds per ton during 1887 and spiked to about 110 British pounds per ton. That would amount to a price of about 25 cents a pound in 1888. So the LME, the London Metal Exchange, recognized what was going on. It was more or less public knowledge. So they decided to introduce, instead of Chili Bar being the only thing you could trade, they introduced something called a good merchandisable brand, GMB, which was acceptable alternative to Chili Bar. And that increased the tradable volume by about 2.5 to 3 times. The copper price collapsed to 40 pound a ton, 12 cents a pound. The syndicate went bankrupt. Secretan took his own life. There was a huge problem with the inventory because they now had something like a 3-year supply of copper in their warehouses that they had to get rid of. And there was a bunch of negotiations about that. And Daly and Ben Hagen basically said, guys, if you want to, we'll sell it at least 7 cents a pound. So they all came to an agreement that they would not let the price go below 10 cents. And that's about where it held for the next few years. So over in Germany, prior to 1872, the country was divided into multiple little statelets, complex trading arrangements. And then, of course, the German Empire united under Prussia in 1872 or 73. There was a Frankfurt firm called P.A. Cohen and Sons, which sold much of the Hanoverian silver and the Saxon copper throughout Germany and Austria. In 1843, an Englishman, he originally had the name of Ralph Moses, but he changed his name to Merton when he came to Germany, and he married Cohen's daughter, and he eventually took over the firm. And in 1860, he sent his oldest son, Henry, to London. And the company named Henry Merton became a founding member of the London Metal Exchange. Then in 1881, the older brother, Wilhelm, renamed the Frankfurt firm Metallgesellschaft, which became quite a famous firm. And in 1886, they set up a US subsidiary called American Metal, which also became quite famous. On the left there is Wilhelm. On the left is Henry. On the right is Wilhelm. This is a look at German consumption between about 1880 and about 1890. And as you can see, the consumption in Germany is rising slightly, but it was only about half of what they really needed. I'm sorry, the domestic supply. And then in 1888, 89, the domestic demand took off. And that actually coincided with the development of significant volume capability to produce electrolytic copper or copper of a purity that could match lake copper. And in fact, Germany and all of Europe actually they were restricted in how much copper they could use for wire during the early period because the US wouldn't sell copper to them, or at least the guys in Michigan wouldn't. But then after 1890, look what happens to German copper. It was 50,000 tons here. And now suddenly it goes all the way up to 250,000 tons. And that all was met by imports. The US production also surged, as did that in the UK and in France, but not quite as much as Germany. So Europe now became an avaricious consumer of imported copper. The US copper price, if you looked at it, was not in free fall. It surged a little bit in 1887 in conjunction with the squeeze in Europe, and again around 1890 it did okay, but it resumed its fall. So 1893, there was a really bad news for the butte producers like Clark and the Lewis-owned brothers, who were producing copper as a byproduct, because silver was demonetized and the price of silver dropped in half. And then in 1895, with the depressed US price and growing European import demand, the US finally said, hey, we're not gaining anything by putting tariffs on ore and metal. We want to be exporters. So they finally eliminated the tariffs. Things started to pick up in the latter part of the 1890s. Gold production in Canada, in Colorado, and South Africa and Australia took off, and we actually had a mildly inflationary environment. Entities like the Rothschilds, who were already invested in Rio Tinto, bought the Hearst shares in Anaconda, which opened up Anaconda a little bit. And then in 88, 89, Henry Rogers and William Rockefeller, Rogers is on the right there, Rockefeller on the left, of Standard Oil, purchased control of Anaconda from Ben Hagen and Daly. If we look at what's happening now in around 900, Europe is now less than 20% of world production. South America is less than 10%, and North America is over 60%. So now North America is completely in control. So that's why it made sense to obviously eliminate the tariffs. And when the Rockefeller and Rogers Group amalgamated, it was what they called Anaconda after they acquired it. They basically started a bunch of games. They joined the way of what we call the big producers like Rio Tinto, Calumet, and Hecla, and began a pattern of limiting production and intermittently stockpiling material to drive up prices. Their target was 20-cent copper, and they succeeded relatively initially. They got good copper prices. But there were other people out there, and particularly Metallica Shellshaft and Merton. And American Metal recognized what was happening, and they would go out and give contracts deliberately to companies like Phelps Dodge, Montana Ore Processing. That was the entity controlled by Augustus Hines in Montana, and others who they invested heavily in refining and in other American mines. John D. Ryan is down here on the lower left. He's an interesting character. He was the son of an Irish immigrant miner in Hancock, Michigan, but showed no interest in mining when he was growing up. He actually apprenticed to an uncle who was a merchant in the area. And then he married very well. He married the stepdaughter of a local congressman. And he made his best move of all when he went to Montana as an oil salesman. But William Scallon, who was the lawyer for Marcus Daly, was also the brother of the Ryan family lawyer. Bryan family physician in Hancock, Michigan. So he got an introduction to Marcus Daly. And when Marcus Daly passed away, he began to manage the Daly funds for Mrs. Daly. He eventually became the head of Amalgamated, and he completed the consolidation of the Butte operations by buying out first Heinz in 1907 and William A. Clark in 1910. Amalgamated, along with Calumet and Heckler, opened sales offices in Germany. There were a whole series of new moguls that developed: James Douglas, William A. Clark, also in Arizona, Daniel Jackling in Arizona and Utah. But Battelle-Gesellschaft continued to dominate the German market. This is what happened. I apologize for some of the graphs here. I couldn't get actual raw data for the London Metal Exchange price, but if you look here in 1900, this is when they consolidated Butte initially. Then in 1907, when they got Heinz, they got the price up again. And then in 1910, when they consolidated Clark, they got the price up again. But in the meantime, the price would come down. And basically, Henry Rogers and John D. Ryan's goal was 20-cent copper, but they really didn't achieve that until we got into the First World War. They got price surges after the consolidations in 1900, 1907, and then when the copper strike was in Michigan in 1913, they got it again. But otherwise, the traders succeeded in keeping the price down by wise investments and buying from other people. So when we summarize all of this, who were the winners? And really, it was the Henry Merton Company, Battelle-Gesellschaft, Siemens, a German industry like Krupp, and Kaiser Billy himself. England and the other major copper importers like France also benefited enormously, as did US copper producers, which were mostly the northeastern states. The losers, well, Eugene, obviously, Spain, Australia, Mexico, and Chile, the countries that produced it. The copper miners, the copper miners on top here, this is an interesting, iconic picture, actually, of the Rio Tinto mine in Spain. That big wheel in the middle is actually an old Roman wheel that was excavated during the initial excavations at Rio Tinto. The copper miners lost out, and some of the shareholders in Calumet and Heckler, Quincy, Anaconda, and Boston and Montana. Beneficiaries, not well known, but Phelps Dodge and James Douglas picked up a bunch of properties in Arizona very cheap between 83 and 86 as a result of the price decline in North America. Augustus Heinz and his Montana Ore Purchasing Company were great beneficiaries because Battelle-Gesellschaft, American Metal, more or less financed them. And Sudbury, Ontario, and its nickel company called Inco, that was largely financed and driven by American Metal and Battelle-Gesellschaft. Now, you won't generally see these people called chumps, but the Rothschilds didn't do very well, and neither did John D. Ryan in his battles. Alexander Agassiz is the guy, I think, that really, if you think about it, in 1880, he had an absolutely unique product. He probably could have charged 10 cents extra into the wiring market if he wanted to. And instead of that, he went out and he cut the price. That had to be one of the great all-time dumb marketing moves. And of course, Eugene Secretan. During World War I, John D. Ryan, who was very good politically and actually went to Washington to work for the government, and he got the US Congress to approve a US copper marketing cartel, but it didn't really work. He didn't do very well after the war. In 1922, Anaconda purchased American Brass. It wasn't a very successful purchase for them. Their return on investment wasn't very good. And they did, as a result of purchasing American Brass, because they didn't have enough copper to supply American Brass, go out and purchase for an enormous price the Guggenheim properties in Chile, which eventually brought them Chiquicamata, which became the great copper mine in the world for about the next 70 years once they discovered the big new vein in the 1930s. Calumet and Hecla survived in the 20s by floating tails dredged from Lake Superior. They never got it. In 1942, they purchased a customer called Wolverine Tube. Sad to see. Again, Nathan Delaney, I'm very thankful for. He's provided an awful lot of the key information in here. And with that, I'll take questions or hopefully be able to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, that was very fascinating. You reminded me of some things I encountered. I'm in Maryland, so I'm near Baltimore, and that 1869 tariff was really hurt the Baltimore smelters, which had been around since 1850, because they used the Welsh smelting method of reverberatory furnaces of using various ores as blends, using fluxing ores with the sulfurets. So when that happened, that tariff, I've got a letter here from Henry Martin, the president of the Baltimore Copper Smelting Company, 1869, against the tariff that Lake Superior was in favor of because it affected the copper content of ores. And so that tariff came in and it killed Eastern smelting, which killed Eastern mines because they had no smelters to then send to. The other interesting thing I encountered that reflects what you were saying was every time the price was up from one of these manipulations, the Eastern mines, like the ones in Vermont, would start, mining and smelting because the price was up to 12, 15, 18 cents a pound, and they could make a go of it with their, medium to low grade ores. And when the price dropped back down, they couldn't make a go of it. So when Secretan did his thing, there was a revival in the Vermont and Tennessee mines, and then that went away. And then with the amalgamated in 1898, 1900, it all happens again. People, the users like Westinghouse, were afraid of not having a good supply at a good price. So Westinghouse bought the Ely mine in Vermont to have his own smelter and own source. And August Heckscher bought the Elizabeth mine. So they're all trying to respond to what was going on with amalgamated to make sure that they had a reliable source. So the only other question or comment I have is your graphs and charts. It had per metric ton, it had per pound, it had all these different measures, and the measure that I've seen most often is the copper ton, 2,352 pounds, which was sort of driven by the Welsh. And so it seems like you always have to break it down into some kind of a uniformity so you can compare numbers. And that's where the price per pound is the most helpful, I think.
Basically, like 40 pounds a ton, British pounds a ton, is the equivalent of US 10 cents a pound. But
one thing I noticed is it didn't mention anything of the effect that the Kennecott operations had, which started about when the price of about the turn of the century of the 1900s, and they must have had a major effect on copper market, especially with the Braden operation, Braden and Utah Copper.
Utah Copper really didn't become a significant factor until flotation came along, and that really made Utah Copper, a very, very competitive. They were a producer, but they were almost, I don't want to say marginal, but it wasn't particularly profitable as long as they were using tables to concentrate copper. But once flotation came in during in the late First World War, then Utah took off. Yes. Kennecott itself, if you're talking about Kennecott, the original Kennecott was in Alaska.
Right.
I was going to ask all of those early 20th century open pit mines, what was the mechanism by which they sold their copper?
Can you be specific?
Well, I'm thinking primarily of how like Utah Copper, they were smelting through American Smelting and Refinery, new smelter there in Garfield. And so I was just wondering at that point, since we really didn't have in those days electrolytic production in this country in large quantities, how they sold it.
Oh yeah, there would be typically a price based on either a U.S. There were some U.S. I don't want to call it standard prices. The COMEX came much later. I don't remember the exact year, but there was a U.S. standard price, and they would have a price on that, and then it would be there would be a smelting charge, and there would also be a charge based on the nature of the ore itself. It depended on what other materials were in the ore. The Utah ore, I believe, had some gold in it, I believe. So all of that was factored in to the contract price that they would get with ASARCO or with Baltimore Refining or whoever. There were lots and lots of independent refiners.
So they essentially sold their product to the smelter and got paid by the smelter.
Yeah. Even Anaconda until probably the late 1890s. It was almost all matte. Their best copper was probably, I don't know, maybe 80% matte. And they were selling that to Swansea, or they were selling it to Baltimore, or they were selling it to whoever for refining to electrolytic grade. Anaconda was quite late getting electrolytic copper up. The Lewisone brothers were way ahead of them. They actually, the Lewisone brothers, deserve a lot more credit. They of all the people in the copper industry, they've, I think, received the least amount of credit, but they actually deserve a lot. Their technology, especially their refining and smelting technology, was first rate. They never had good mines, but they had very good smelting technology.
I think a lot of the challenge out west early on was fuel. I mean, you in railroad transportation, it takes a lot of fuel to smelt. And so if you did a partial smelt to matte, then you could at least ship it somewhere and let someone who has cheaper fuel finish it up, because all the forests are cut down, the charcoal's gone, and it becomes quite a challenge on the smelting in areas if there's not good fuel.
Go ahead.
So I'm working on a project right now that is a railroad district out here by Elko. And one of the interesting things I found that I didn't know is they started with charcoal. They had some on-site smelters, small smelters, actually imported coke for a long time for their smelters until they shut down in the late 1880s from Pennsylvania. So getting that in, getting it 30 miles from the railroad, and then moving it back, they did produce bar and matte, but at a significant cost.
Well, in Montana, they got coal from there was a coal field near Great Falls in the northern portion of the state, and they also brought coal up from south western Wyoming, the area around Alma and some other areas, and Daly actually owned mines in both of those locations. And in the 1890s. Yeah, he had major interests in timber and coal and all kinds of other things as well in Montana.
One of the advantages that the Keweenaw or the Michigan copper providers had is they were mining for the most part native copper, which was a direct smelting ore, and smelting was very uncomplicated and consequently probably economical as compared to some of the other copper producers. But they could basically direct ship directly from the Keweenaw by lake boat or by railroad, but more commonly by lake boat, big copper that was really required no further refining or very little further refining, except where they were going to extract silver, which was a fairly substantial component of those ores.
Yeah, as you say, it was native copper. When in the period right around 1880, when the electrolytic or the electrical wire demand started first, melting in the Keweenaw itself was still at a very early stage. They did smelting, but they produced mostly a matte because the railroads had only arrived there about 1878, 79. And it was still fairly expensive to bring in coal because you'd have to bring it in, in the 6 months of the year that they could ship stuff in and then store it all winter. So they were primarily, making a matte at that time. Now, once the railroads came in and coal became cheap and there was a demand for the higher purity copper, then they began smelting to the 99% up there routinely. Yes. Anybody else?
Well, thank you very much, Ed. That was very good.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, guys.